Sellars Conference, Day 2, Talk 2.
I feel like a rocky day to feel almost. I don't get those.
Kann ich meine Schreibunterlagen wieder haben? Also nicht meine Texte.
Oh, warte mal, wo haben wir diese Schreibunterlagen?
Und es ist genau, also die Form von der Möglichkeit da.
Eine schwarze Mappe.
Ist das eine von denen hier?
Richtig schwarz.
Richtig schwarz.
What are you looking for, Thomas?
This is kind of black folder. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. I will not tell you that I'm not Michael Kramer, because you wouldn't believe me if I told you otherwise. I'm happy to introduce Jim O'Shea, in part because I don't really have to introduce him to this group of people, and in part because he's one of the leading Kantian Sellarians. And he will talk to us about Kant on the status of regulative principles. Do you want to make some introductory remarks? Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I was thinking of Paul Ziff, apparently at Chapel Hill, used to give back graduate student papers as soon as he encountered a sentence that he thought was false, which saved him a lot of work. And after talking to Mike and Mark, I know that every event has a cause is already going to be hand back the paper. But my interest in this really is trying to figure out how certain views of Kant hang together. And so I think it's an interesting question how much you can take out from Kant and defend today. But it's not really what I'm interested in here is how Kant's system hangs together. It's a less ambitious question. And so what I try to do in the paper is take two different puzzles in Kant and use them to illuminate each other and give a reading that I seem to think hangs together, even though it's very difficult. The issues are very difficult. So the one issue, the second one first, is the status of these regulative maxims of reason. And the difficulty there is that Kant says very firmly, both at the beginning of the dialectic and in the appendix, that the regulative maxims of reason are not objectively valid. They prescribe no law to objects. They have a merely subjective validity. But he also says then when the appendix comes that they are objectively valid. They're indeterminately objectively valid, he says. But he has lots of things to say about how the vocation of reason presupposes that this sort of systematicity is true of nature itself. So some commentators say there's just Kant it's incoherent. There's a lot of commentators that say it doesn't hang together. So what I try to do is then, in relation to the analogy, I should say, first of all, just by the way, that there are two regulative constitutive distinctions, which is important to keep in mind, so that the analogies are regulative in comparison with the axioms and the anticipations, but all four principles of understanding are constitutive of experience compared to the regulative maxims. So sometimes I'm speaking of the second analogy as regulative, sometimes as constitutive. It depends which of those. So basically what I argue is that a proper reading of, for example, the second analogy shows that the second analogy does entail that there must exist empirical causal laws covering any event. And that positions me in relation to this famous dispute about weak and strong readings of the second analogy. But what that does is, I think, set up what Kant calls in the third critique certain needs of reason, that is, Verstandesbedürfnis, that needs of understanding, not just the interests of reason, but strictly empirical needs of transcendental understanding. The second analogy entails that there must exist particular empirical causal laws. That's what it is for the second analogy to be instantiated. So that's a strict constitutive requirement of the understanding. And that's why in both the third critique, in the introductions to the third critique, and in the appendix, Kant is assuming that there are to be empirical laws, and an empirical lawfulness and empirical kinds. That follows from the understanding, not just the interests of reason and systematicity. But the thing is that the understanding can't determine a priori anything about particular empirical laws. So it entails that there must be such, but can't determine what empirical laws in particular there are. Then Kant argues that, the regulative maxims of reason that specify that there's empirical uniformity of an a priori indeterminable kind and degree. We don't know what kind of empirical uniformity there is. He argues that's necessary for the possibility of instantiating the categorical laws of understanding. In the third critique, he talks a lot about there have to be empirical laws that instantiate the universal laws of understanding, but it's an entirely contingent matter as far as the understanding is concerned a priori. What kind of, and that's what he calls purposiveness. It's what's lawful but contingent. It's contingent in relation to the laws of understanding, but it's lawful in that the understanding demands that the only way the understanding gets instantiated is in empirical laws and empirical kinds. So I feel like those distinctions enable me to sort everything out. So let's say whenever Kant talks about the regulative maxims as merely subjectively valid, he's contrasting it with the strictly constitutive objective validity of the laws of understanding. When he says that they have an objective but indeterminate validity, the term indeterminate is crucial, because he's saying it's true of nature itself that it exhibits empirical uniformities and kind subordinations, but there's no determining a priori what those are. And so that enables me to understand the sense in which they're objective and the sense in which they are merely subjectively valid. And that depends on the reading of the second analogy that I take to be correct. And then this is just interesting, I think, in other respects. It gives you a grip on what a regulative principle is, such that both the analogies and the maxims are regulative principles. They both make indeterminate existence claims, where indeterminate means not a priori specified. It gives you a good view of the relationship between the empirical level and the transcendental level in Kant, and why all this first introduction to the third critique stuff about searching for a concept and groping about, that has to be well grounded based on strictly constitutive demands of the understanding. So I differ from a lot of commentators, Buchdahl and Susan Nyman and others, who have a lot of insights, but they place a lot of weight on the intrinsic interests of reason, but I think the only validity that comes in these matters comes from the constitutive demands of understanding. And Kant's ingenious strategy is to embed the regulative maxims to show that they're necessary for satisfying those demands of understanding. So that's what I try to do.
Okay, before we start, I will adopt the method of distinguishing hands and fingers, but I will try to limit the number of fingers per hand, maybe to 5, which seems a natural choice, so that we get to the hands. I will try that.
Is it possible to start with a finger?
No.
I think that's logically. But is that a finger or
No, a hand.
A hand, please, go on.
Okay.
It's like starting a sentence with an anaphor.
But which is possible.
Michael will later give the comment.
Okay. Well, Jim, first of all, thank you. Well, it was a pleasure to read that paper, and I think I'm in agreement with much of it. I have only one worry about the relationship between the first and the third critique. And you seem to suggest, but I wasn't completely sure about that, you seem to suggest that it's basically the same chaos or type of chaos arguments that is driving the argument in the appendix to the dialectics and of the first critique and in the introduction to the third critique. And I think I would want to dispute that because whereas in the first critique he's in a quote you have a lengthy quote on the I think third to last page or something like that, from the dialectics, it seems like he's really arguing that experience wouldn't be possible without those regulative principles, and that's important for your argument, I take, in connection with the analogies. Whereas in the third critique, he seems to presuppose that experience is possible, it has to be possible after all. What we do not know is whether the specific empirical laws we find are really possible to be embedded in what he there calls an overall connected experience of the world as a whole, or something like that, which means whole hierarchy of interdependent laws which are subsumed under the most general laws, which then justifies the principle of the purposiveness of judgment. So, of course, one would have to consider wherein the difference consists, given that this difference in argument and chaos argument, as were, points to a difference between the respective things that are the specific homogeneity of the objects of this homogeneity in both cases. I'm not that sure about it. A hint or a try would be attempt to clarify that would be that in the whereas in the first critique it's objects, the homogeneity in objects, the subsumption of objects under kinds of objects and so on. The law of seeking unity in objects is the law of homogeneity in question, whereas in the third critique is the homogeneity of laws, homogeneity in theory, law of seeking unity in laws, and so on. So this would be a suggestion as to the difference. I don't see that it makes much of a difference for the core of your argument, but for the relation between.
So when I went through all this stuff, it's been a while since now I've looked at the first two introductions, but I found both in both. So both an emphasis on, so say in the first introduction to the third critique, he talks about finding an empirical concept for a particular. So he tends to emphasize in the published introduction that universal laws have to be instantiated in empirical laws. He also emphasizes that in the appendix. But he also, in both places, sometimes talks about finding a concept of the concept of an object that's the appropriate concept. So I tended to find both in both. I mean, so the relationship between kinds and laws is subtle anyway. But I think he emphasizes both. So you get the same three principles of homogeneity specification and affinity in the introduction to the third critique, just for example.
I wouldn't say it's the same. I mean, that would be part of my argument.
So I'm saying that. So I'm just saying. What my view is that they're the same. And the first point you raised, your suggestion was one's focusing on laws, one's focusing on
that was.
And when I went, I recall not thinking that's the case when I go through them. Okay. And then with regard to people go different ways on this. Actually, Geyer thinks the appendix doesn't argue that these maxims are necessary for the possibility of experience, even though Kant says they are. And but they can't shift. But they can't shift it to the third critique and held that. And then Geyer is an interesting view that distinction collapses. But Wartenberg and others argue the reverse, and that the third critique argues that the reverse of whatever I just said for guys. Mine's the same in both. So now, with regard to the third critique, he'll say something like, nature could present such a variety, especially in the first introduction, but also in the published one, that the understanding would find no opportunity to instantiate its categories and discover them.
He doesn't say that. I went through this, not in the published version at least. Maybe in the first introduction, but not in the public version.
There's no chaos scenarios.
That's not the scenario he's in. It would have to be in the deduction paragraph. I went through the whole thing just to make sure, but he's really not committed to that.
And actually, that's not.
I've got a few quotes that only in German, but I think that.
Yeah. He certainly has, so in the first introduction he has the chaos scenarios. I thought he had it in the published one too. But at any rate, that's not essential to wait on.
No, it is essential to get over.
Here's the essential.
Well, what for me is interesting here is there really something different going on in the introduction to the critique, in the deduction he has there, and is this really contributing something new, or isn't it contributing something new? And the way he argues there, or seems to argue, it suggests that something new is going on. So that is something, an appearance I would like to say. I would overall prefer to simply saying, well, he already had this stuff in the...
Well, that in itself is interesting, because of course, so I think in the published introduction, what gets emphasized in, I forget, section 5, 4 and 5, those crucial ones, is the stuff about universal lawfulness, needing instantiation in empirical laws. And I see that argument as quite strongly parallel to what I argue in the relationship between the analogies and then you get the argument that but this could happen in a variety of ways we can't constitute or determine. So we don't have insight, is his word, Einsicht, into what the form of these empirical laws will be, but we know that they're. And there's passages that drive people crazy that Kant says we don't know this principle, but when you get those passages, they involve having insight, and that involves what I call determining.
That's why it's so nearly reflective.
Right. So on the wider question, though, just because it's interesting, well, then what's distinctive about the introduction to the third critique? Well, some of this has to do with the previous talk about pleasure, and because in the preface he says, were it not for the pleasure involved in aesthetic judgment, this could have formed an appendix to the theoretical part of philosophy. Now, I take that to refer to the appendix to the dialectic.
I do.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
But I still, this would be like a genuine addition to the appendix, versus it's already there in the appendix. I mean, there are two ways of reading this, and he is presenting it as a genuine addition and not as something which could be found already there. So I wouldn't have to write
appendix to the appendix.
Right. So my view would be that the only thing that the introductions that specify not teleology, not aesthetics, but logical purposiveness, the general one, at its heart, continues the same line of picks up on the same line of argument, and then it's important that he can do that for what he wants to do in the book. But I think the continuity is a strength. That aspect, the general principle of purposiveness, not aesthetic, not teleological, is already grounded in. So.
I would want to stress the continuity. I
but
just
no,
would say that it's like from a different perspective.
Right.
If you see the law aspect, as it were, can be generated out of the natural kind and subsumption of kinds aspect in a way. Yeah. But it's like two coins of a matter.
Yeah, definitely.
Did you think you had a quotation that just from Jim?
No, it would be no. The thing is that Jim said it seems obvious that he's talking about making the more general both points, and I think I can only find evidence for the point. So this would be a lengthy quote if we would have to do it.
You have a finger?
Thanks.
Yeah. Just on this point about whether something is added in the idea of reflective judgment in Introduction to the Third Critique. I haven't read that in a long time, but I seem to remember a concern there that it's not simply epistemic. That is the way that you're and the way that you're characterizing the regulative maxims and principles that are discussed in the appendix, really stress the sort of the epistemic or heuristic or methodological role that these maxims play in discovering, or specifying what the empirical laws are. But from what I remember, that although that is a concern in the introduction to the Third Critique as well, it seems like there's an additional worry there about simply having a way of conceiving like a generalization as a law in the first place. So there's sort of a conceptual problem, something more like a conceptual problem of conceiving of something as necessary as a law, that in order to do that you have to suppose that that nature is that nature is lawful or something like that, for the understanding that so there it seems like there's I don't know if that worry is also in the appendix. I haven't read that in a while either, but it does seem like there's a separate worry that's coming into play that's not simply epistemic.
The necessity of empirical laws.
Yeah.
I mean, in the sense of, there's two senses of that. One is that there needs to be empirical laws, but you mean
right. That seems like right. That's taken care of by the second analogy.
But you mean that this so-called necessity some says because it's complex. This sense
of a particular of anything that purports to be a particular empirical law, conceiving of that as an empirical law at all, as opposed to just a contingent fact or a general location fact.
Yeah, I do think so. When you look at the appendix to the dialectic, then the issues about the discussion in the Third Critique is very rich in relation to the moral philosophy and the theoretical conception of nature, and then judgment as sort of unifying these realms. You do get anticipations of that in the second half of the appendix on purposiveness and all this sort of stuff. And I think you do get an emphasis on, but maybe you and Johannes are right that I think you do get an emphasis on empirical laws in the Third Critique that's stronger than the emphasis in the appendix. It'll be helpful for me to go back and look again. I think there's both in both, but the structure of the argument I think is the same. You get in the third introduction of the Third Critique, there must be empirical laws to instantiate the categorical laws, to put it crudely, the transcendental laws. We can't have insight into what they are. Here are these broad assumptions of how nature hangs together purposively, and you get the same sorts of maxims laid out. You get them more neatly generalized as in terms of purposiveness. The idea that sort of nature's made for us to know it. But it's the same sort of thing, that in our search for empirical laws, we are kind of broadly justified in assuming that nature will hang together in its details in such a way as to give us opportunity to instantiate the universal laws. that I find in both of them that, if you want to call it epistemic, that broadly epistemic argument. And it's interesting that so the flavor of the introductions, before you get to aesthetic and teleological judgments, but is broadly in terms of laws, hypothetical judgment versus determinative judgment, what it's going to take to have a knowledge of nature where there are empirical laws, and then what sorts of more flexible, systematic assumptions make that possible. So I find them, I think, both, but maybe I'm going to keep in mind this idea that maybe there's a reason for the greater focus on laws.
Mark.
So Jim, so in thinking about what might be true in all this, so I want to distinguish two claims. One that I think is right, that Kant rightly saw and that you've articulated well, that there's, at any given point in time, there's these two different functions. There's what you're calling the regulative principles that play this structuring function of providing candidates for empirical investigation and gives us the structure that the laws governing those can have and all of this. A second claim, quite independent of that. And that the former are not themselves subject to empirical investigation because they're providing the raw materials within which empirical investigation happens, right? The second claim is that distinction is stable over time. And that, I think, is the indefensible claim. Not that Kant said it, but that it's in fact. So for a simple, this is just an analogy, but a very familiar one, think of Ptolemaic astronomy in 1250, right? You've got certain kinds of regulative principles, roughly the do it with circles principle, and within that we formulate specific laws that can then be tested, and we make specific observations about what circular path that various heavenly bodies are traveling upon, and we refute some and we reject. Then what happens is that eventually we start having a different category of pressure, namely that the whole thing starts looking like an ad hoc degenerating research program. Mm-hmm. And that's, when you start thinking of it like that, you're thinking of the empirical observations as putting pressure upon the framework principle. And I think this precisely is what happened in the 20th century to some of these Kantian principles. It's absolutely true absolutely right that principles like causation in the abstract regulative sense define kinds of things that one can empirically investigate and things of this sort. But then just in Hoagland's sense, those generate they also define an excluded zone, things that are made observable by adherence to those versus the things that are possible. And so then we have two-slit experiments and various kinds of interference phenomena that put global pressure on the framework presumptions of how we're doing physics, and we realize that, boy, maybe we have to see the general structures in terms of gauge symmetries and statistical distributions and scrap that stuff. So it's like, and I feel like most people who talk about this, it's either that they want to say the distinction isn't there at all, so it's all just a mush of claims and they all are subject to empirical refutation, or the sort of the once and for all a priorism of certain of them is right. And it seems to me both of those have to go, given how things actually went. At any given point, there has to be these two different functions you're talking about, but it also has to be possible to for experience to transform the character of what was functioning as a regulative principle into itself being an object of actual empirical refutation, and hence there being alternatives dreamt up to it.
I think one of the things that didn't quite figure in what you were saying, I thought, is one, you need these constitutive principles, these allegedly. So although in contrast to the mathematical principles, the causal law, the principle of causality, let's say, is regulative. And this you might think is indefensible, this part, but that's supposed to be constitutive across all these frameworks. And so we very much change. Now, what
that's the part I'm disagreeing with. I'm saying it is constitutive within frameworks, but then it can become an object of I mean, it just did become an
Right.
object of empirical investigation.
So, because what I think a focus on the appendix does is precisely show that Kant was interested in the sorts of changes you're talking about, which is, granted that he holds this controversial thing about to just apprehend any change as a change, you need some notion of causal consequence.
Mm-hmm.
That's controversial. But the thing he does in the appendix is then say there are going to be broader principles of intelligibility that are fallible, they're hypothetical, but they say set the agenda for coherent empirical inquiry, like do it all with circles.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so his view is those change, those are abandoned.
Right.
But the allegedly...
that's why I said that was just an analogy.
Okay, but well, it's interesting that the things you discuss are interesting in relation to this part, because this shows that he had an awareness that the, as it were, constitutive framework principles for empirical science are going to be, they're regulative actually, but they're going to be fallible and changeable. So, but you're right. So where you're really digging in is just on the idea that there are any constitutive.
Yeah, I can't see any reason. I mean, certainly in the case of the causal principle you're talking about, it just seems to me it's just that he was just wrong.
I mean that's why I said that. I was thinking that when I said the Ziff principle that right, we're going to have what we have to talk about then is there, which I think are important and deep questions. Are there any principles that are true across that are necessary for the possibility of experience?
What I'm suggesting is that there's a quantifier ambiguity in that. For any time t, there have to be principles that are necessary for the possibility of experience at t.
Yeah.
But there's not a principle such that for all t, that principle is necessary for the possibility of experience.
I think that's what Friedman's doing. I think that's what Sellars, Friedman, there's a whole tradition of Kantians, neo-Kantians that want us to do exactly what you're doing, to deny.
I feel like most of them
it starts with
end up denying both of them, though. I mean,
I don't think Michael Friedman or Sellars or C.I. Lewis they all hold that it's necessary. They do the quantifier shift thing that you were doing and say, for any particular framework in which you have knowledge of an object, there are going to be principles that are relatively a priori, that is, that are sort of framework assumptions that make it possible.
Yeah, I guess when Sellars makes remarks about any change is a change in meaning, it seems to me he's precisely going against there being any such distinction even at a time.
Well, we were talking about that yesterday, and those are difficult issues. The attempt to make natural laws sort of broad truths of meaning within, but he wants to maintain something like that distinction.
Fine, it's in is there a synthetic a priori? It gives you precisely that quantifier.
You're right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay.
But I think it's like you were saying yesterday, it's a big issue. It's considering that if you want to figure out the truth of these things, then putting pressure on just how much of this can you hold when you move to Bell's other scientific perspective.
Just a little thing on this. So I'm sympathetic to all that. One way to go would be still to try to retrench and find these true Kantian principles that can never be changed. But one reason why the problem might arise, if you look just the way the system's set out, with respect to your transcendental law of causality or whatever, there's already the slippage from just the notion of there being categories and there being these particular principles. I mean, it's possible some Kantian might awake in the 22nd century and say, oh my gosh, the book is really good up to the analogies. But because there's nothing said, if you ask where those principles come from, he just kind of says, "Hey, here's one I grabbed out of the air, and gee, I think I got a proof for it." And we got some counterexamples, but maybe we're just not, young enough. We'll wait a few centuries and we'll get the right principle that goes with the category table, maybe.
Like maybe something is maybe to have the concept of an event or a change, you need something that's modally significant in some way, that co-varies systematically, but doesn't require necessary sequence in time.
Symmetry or whatever.
Yeah.
That's pretty strong.
I didn't do it, Carl.
Let's take a commitment here.
I'm finger on this, but I don't really. I mean, it depends what Kant thinks the principle is. I mean, if the principle is for matter, no matter how small we can individuate it, say at the level of the particle, there's a causal principle that says, we can bring it under a certain kind of law-like description, then he's in trouble. But the principle is, in order to have, a certain kind of description of nature, we need law. In order to have law, there has to be a causal relationship between one state and another. There is causal relationships between quantum states and other states. We understand them as statistical aggregates, but the laws wouldn't hold to the very smallest decimal place. If at the level of description in which they held, you couldn't sort things in time, with respect to causal principles like Kant wanted. So it's just a question about what the principle is. But if it's a principle, it's a formal principle about the character of the possibility of a certain description of nature, I don't see that the wrong level to apply it turns out to be the level of the individual particle. It overturns anything, actually. And so I think this is just connected with Robert saying it seems kind of spineless then in response to that long level of applying it to say, let's just try to weaken the principle. I mean, it's not clear what we do.
I don't have I myself have taken that response to that case. There's lawful dependence without. But, am I absolutely confident that when I look further into Bell's theorem and learned about all kinds of things that I'm going to be absolutely confident that any way I have of specifying that kind of dependence? I think you're right about what that Kant's view entails, that the concept of nature requires, in order to have a concept of time, you need lawful dependence. Sequence of some kind, a natural law, right? And that can respond to some of these cases, and that is less weak than and I guess I can try to say, yes, I'm going to hold that in all possible.
You can't. If the claim is just that we can read Kant as saying nothing more than that there has to be causal connection somewhere around somewhere to do anything, then maybe. But that's not what. And on the other hand, you can't just say that these challenges only occur for little bitty things, because it's just plain false. We can construct an arbitrarily large system that will violate the law of there being a determinate cause. Just perfectly trivial, really. You just have to wire up a big-ass explosion to one decay of one particle, and so you've got a really big dramatic event that doesn't. So if Kant's making a claim about the distributive claim about the intelligibility of macro-level perceptible experiences, that they be in a determinate causal order, he's just wrong.
I knew I'd get into just defending the principle of the second analogy, but I think he's arguing that the very concept of an event, or a change as opposed to a sequence of experiences that's not of a change, requires a general distinction between a necessitation in the things themselves. In the
I think the concept did require that when he was alive. And now it's been refuted.
So, I mean, it's supposed to be. So I guess Sellars, just out of interest, I take him to disagree with you, right? In this sense, he thinks the very concept of an event occurring here and now requires. Now he broadens it to be inference principles that are. He calls them physical necessitation principles in one place, but the very idea of something happening here and now, an event here and now, is essentially conceptually tied to the idea of its having resulted from something occurring there then, by the nature of what's there then. It implies laws of nature. So, I mean, he could be wrong too, but he
insofar as he says that, but it
doesn't.
Well, I mean, aren't you? It seems to me that the sort of the variable here is the word. It sounds like everyone thinks they know what a law of nature looks like, what a causal law is like. But in fact, aren't we discovering that the form of a law that Kant thought he knew pretty well, which was basically Newtonian, well, we don't buy that anymore, really. I mean, although my physicist friends are very reluctant to say that Newton was false. But still, I mean, things have changed, and I think it's not yet clear just what you're committed to when you're committed to the idea that nature has to proceed lawfully, or in order to cognize the occurrence of an event, you have to see it as participating in some lawful structure.
Right. That's
we have to figure out what the heck that means.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be necessitating.
Michael has a finger.
Well, it's virtually the same point. I mean, one question is, are we committed to laws, or is the world just one damn thing after another? That's a separate question as to whether the laws are deterministic in form, right? That's not the same question as to whether there are laws versus extensional generalizations. So, I mean, the notion of statistical law, of course, is not a completely transparent notion. I mean, but nevertheless, analytically, I think surely we separate those questions, whether there's... and Sellars was very clear, right, that nomologicals had to be distinguished from mere extensional universal quantification.
Oh, yeah.
Although he has this weird idea of a world story in which, of course, technically speaking, the whole truth is contained without the laws. That's the funny...
This non-modal.
Yeah, that's the funny counterpart of
story at all.
Yeah, but it's the funny counterpart of the purely descriptive account of the world without any of the deontic, stuff layered over.
I don't understand
one damn thing after another.
Well, I don't either, but he did think it.
but saying that you reject mere extensional statements as laws doesn't yet settle whether you would accept things like statistical probability distributions as a law. And I don't know any Wilfred text that commits him to not counting those, or that explicitly endorses those.
Well, actually, there's some passages in the third of the Karras lectures where he decries our rigid adherence to a mechanistic conception of
bless your heart. Good. So then he would not say what you just attributed to.
What he seems to think is that, what I think he thinks is that there's something right about the idea that our possible experience of the world of objects requires a distinction between the order in which we experience them and the order they have in themselves, that requires a modal concept saying that they determine their own order. It's very Straussonian in Sellars. And then on top of that, he argues that we can have a revised view of the world where we depend on that conception, but we formulate a world that's entirely non-modal and is just one damn thing after another. Right. So I think he accepts Kant's argument, but thinks we can go beyond it in a careful way.
Okay, I think this...
Let's be careful with the order they have in themselves these days, folks.
Okay, I think this hand has at least 5 fingers now. We'll go to the next hand, and that is Steve's.
Oh, okay. Coming back to the chaos passage, could you say what you mean by chaos?
Right. So there's the Cinnabar passage as well in the deduction. It's where it's really in a way defined in terms of what wouldn't give us opportunity to apply an empirical concept. So if you take it, Cinnabar, where one moment red, one moment yellow, and all this sort of stuff, there'd be no way to apply the concept from one moment to the next. You'd have how does he define chaos? It's in terms of a thought experiment where take any empirical concept, then imagine the frustration, imagine any of its projections being frustrated in the next moment. Something like that, I would think. But I haven't really thought through carefully.
Did he use the term chaos?
Which term?
The term chaos in that passage?
No, probably not. That was probably my handy.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I wanted to ask you was whether what he was saying in that
passage
that the acutest human understanding could never discover by comparison, could never detect the slightest similarity.
Right. And I think that, excuse me, what he says just before that
so great a variety
offers an account of why that would be so, right? There's such variety. So it doesn't seem as though he's considering a scenario where there's chaos in at least one way of understanding the term, but rather he's just considering the case where the profusion, the rich profusion of nature in its variety were such that our capacities of discernment were not up to the task of recognizing, making the comparisons that we would need to frame concepts that we could then use to even so much as cognize objects or represent laws. He says there would be no experience, no understanding in that. Under those conditions,
I think that's right. It's about this.
Okay.
Chaos might add a premise that's irrelevant. That's.
The worry was just that might suggest something that would take back the second analogy. It seems as though what he's describing is consistent. Doesn't have to be read as implying that the second analogy, the principle of the second analogy, might not.
Well, that's interesting, though, because I guess on my story, the second analogy entails that the sort of variety here is not the case if there's to be any cognition of objects of experience, this sort of variety in which no empirical concept application would be possible, and then he says so the understanding itself would be impossible, we'd have no concept of genera. So I am arguing that the sort of variety such that the acutest human understanding could never detect similarity isn't the ground of argument for the second analogy, but is inconsistent with the instantiation of the second analogy in any empirical laws. That's crucial to my case.
We wouldn't be around to do it. So, but it doesn't seem to me as though the talk of variety cuts any ice against the principle of the second analogy. It doesn't speak to the question of the variety and how.
This is what's interesting about the case. The second analogy just says in order to, and this is what we've been debating, but to in some sense have cognition of an event, there has to be a judgment that any given alteration is necessitated. Then he argues here that if there were so great a variety that the human understanding couldn't detect the slightest similarity, there'd be no empirical concepts, no genera, and so no understanding at all. Then this is exactly what I'm saying, that the constitutive demands of understanding would be unmeetable. And that's precisely what gives the regular principles that nature is commensurate with our understanding in an indeterminately, a priori, indeterminately specifiable way. So it is the case that this sort of thing does not obtain if experience is to be lost. It's not part of the ground of the argument for the second analogy, but the second analogy entails that this scenario can't be the case if experience is to be possible.
Well, it seems to me that he's pointing to a different condition here, something like a material condition of the possibility of experience, as opposed to a formal condition.
But my view is that the categories, this is Sellars' view, I think, too, which is insightful, I think, in him. The categories are second-order concepts, and the transcendental principles are second-order principles that say there must be what you're calling first-order empirical or material principles of the right kind. So I'm seeing Kant as arguing that unless there's a background assumption of purposiveness and systematicity, general purposiveness, what those assumptions reflect is our justified assumption that this sort of understanding undermining variety does not obtain. Because if it did obtain, there'd be no empirical concepts and therefore no instantiation of the understanding itself. That's how I'm reading.
Well, I was just taking the second analogy to leave open the possibility of a variety that's so rich that we can't discern the commonalities, even though for every event there's a cause.
So this
it's
is
just
what
so fine-grained that
this is interesting. So this is what I think it leaves open. Nothing is entailed about what kinds of empirical uniformities there are.
Right.
In this sense that there's no particular kind of empirical uniformity that's entailed by the second analogy. But the interesting thing about this argument that people miss, I think, is precisely that since the second analogy does entail that there must be empirical causal laws covering any given, whether that's true or false or not, then he gives an argument that unless we could assume that there was this kind of uniformity in things, even though we can't determine what it is or how great, then the instantiation of the second... So the second analogy doesn't determine what kinds of... things could be very various, as he says in the third critique. We can hope that physics would be unified or something, but he says if it turns out there's quite a variety, we're open to discovering that as well. But that's different from saying there's such a variety that it frustrates the application of any empirical concepts which is imagined in these scenarios. So that's exactly what you're saying is what I think people miss, that the second analogy does entail that there are empirical causal laws. These interesting arguments specify further conditions on that, and so those are necessary for the
that seems right to me too.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I liked about your piece. I was taking it that we can. The second analogy provides a formal condition of the possibility of our experiencing nature.
Right.
But these reflections, which are really, I think, seem to draw on reflections on the condition of on what's required, not just for the possibility of experience, but for the actual experience we have. The fact that we have experience with concepts and can make judgments already implies that there's some uniformity in nature that we can discern. But the degree is indeterminate. And so there are these transcendental principles that he identifies for each of the regulative principles. So we get a priori objective knowledge of the uniformity of nature, but with an indeterminacy in respect of degree, and also in the ultimate organization of the order. And then it seems at the end he wants to add the idea of a maximal systematicity that would be used as a kind of a analogon of a schema to give us an ideal to advance towards. Is that? I mean, I wasn't sure about whether you accepted that last aspect of his account. The last step, because you didn't want the final.
The maximal.
I didn't seem to want that, but I wasn't sure why you were resisting that final step. That seems to me to be.
I think you can.
Available.
I'm still interested in how you're reading. Whether we're agreeing on the thing that we're close to agreeing about the relationship between, say, the second analogy and this sort of argument, and then I'll get to the maximal thing. But my view is that the reason that these assumptions of generic uniformity and specificity, which are a priori indeterminate, the reason they have such objective validity as they do is that they're strictly necessary for the possibility of experience. Because the second analogy, the analogies and the laws of understanding, the constitutive laws themselves would not be applicable unless nature conformed in some a priori unspecifiable degree to these maxims. So maybe that agrees.
That's a little different from the way I was thinking of it.
Well, that's interesting. Close. On the maximal thing, the thing is that we can't specify. How are we going to specify what nature has that conforms to these maxims, which are very much don't assume too much variety, but assume some simplicity. And the only determinate thing you can say is then the big maximal idea, the idea that nature's as if it's completely well ordered. And then Kant tries to say that when we formulate that in terms of the idea of God, this is the ideal is kind of the maximal way to really specify that. We can actually get a kind of transcendental deduction or justification of that maximizing ideas, concept, because he tries to argue that it never hurts inquiry and all. I mean, those are all the ethical things that come in afterwards, but he tries to argue in that second section of the appendix that these ideas, the soul is a good idea, prevents materialism, and God's a good idea. But I wanted to...
You don't like those, I know, but there's a step. I mean, there's a step to the maximal ideal, and then there's the further deduction of the ideas that's supported by that idea of a maximal. And I was asking why don't you go at least as far as the maximal? Is it because you think that will bring with it the reliance on the ideas, or
no? Good. So I think you could say that why do we have this idea of the maximum of empirical systematicity? It's because we don't have any firm grip on other way of giving a kind of semantics for what these principles could be. Because anything you say would be too specific.
You can't use them until you have... You're useless, really.
And that's an interesting idea. So I didn't have any... One thing I didn't want to assume is that idea is intrinsically valid because of the interests of reason. That reason has its own intrinsic teleology. It wants to be self-satisfying and all this sort of stuff. But if I'm underestimating an argument that see, the way I sort of see it is like in Johannes's paper where you get a move, and in Sellars when you get a move to the complete ideal, often I don't see a step to the need for the complete language triumphant ideal or the maximal ideal in that sense. So what do I take away as true from Sellars' insights in the appendix? I think that what's valuable is his sense that scientific inquiry, if you're just talking about instantiating the categories, which you do have to talk about, maybe you can get these metaphysical foundations of science, that in his mind, I'm not talking about what's true, but you can get these movable matter subject to forces. But I think he sees that if you're going to talk about any particular empirical event and what sorts of intelligible relations it's caught up in, you're going to need these broader principles that are fallible, hypothetical, involve simplicity considerations and so on. So I just wanted to sort of emphasize that I'm not relying on that interesting aspect of the argument. I'm not relying on any stronger claim of the validity of a maximizing idea.
Okay. I would like to take in Matt, who has a finger for a long time now.
I felt sympathy for your reading of the Chaos passage, and I just wanted to understand what the nature of the issue was. I mean, I took it a law belongs to a system of laws, and that if there were not certain kinds of constraints on the system, that there's a worry about it not being determinate, that one thing is a law as opposed to another. So not merely a question of whether we can discover the laws. I thought that I think this is in the spirit of your understanding of the issue that the reason that these regulative principles of reason complete the understanding is because they make it the case that the demands of the understanding have a determinate application to nature. And Steve, so are you committed to resisting that thought? That it's something weaker than that. That we're this. I thought the spectrum was being raised of a multiplicity of proposals about laws that alterations are governed by, no one of which is decidedly better than others. So there is nothing that our cognition is required to endorse as it seeks to understand nature. And then this idea that simpler is preferable or something, for instance, might offer a constraint.
As if we were contemplating complete hypotheses or something like that of systems of laws, or
I suppose so. But I mean, you might encounter this issue at any point along your path, right? I mean, but sure, let us consider, as it were. I mean, this just comes out of the thought: a law is a law only in as much as it has a place in a system of laws, right?
Well, that's a thought that's not in play in the context of this argument, though. The idea of a system of laws isn't really alive in this context that I remember. It seemed to me that the second analogy doesn't rule out the possibility of everything's having a cause, but the laws that determine those events to occur are so specific or fine-grained that we can't notice the similarities that would enable us to see a regularity, something like that. That was the way I was understanding the point in that paragraph. So the very fact that we have concepts already, it just displays a certain kind of generality in the order of nature sufficient for us to apprehend it. It's not specified how great, beyond just saying, well, it's great enough for us to get some of it anyway. We're on to some of the order in nature. Mm-hmm. So there's an indeterminate objective validity to the principle, the logical principle in genera. That's the thought that I take to be conveyed there, and that's far short of the idea of maximal unity.
Yeah, we agree on that. Yeah.
So I'm taking it to be a kind of a very different kind of reflection from the sort that we find in the second analogy. It's drawn from reflections on the fact of experience, as opposed to the conditions of the possibility of experience.
Yeah, but then that last bit is what Kant apparently says, and this is what I'm arguing. He has interesting reasons to say these are conditions on the very possibility of experience. That's what he says. The idea that
you mean the logical laws, or the logical laws themselves?
Yeah, the idea that nature exhibits some a priori indeterminable degree of uniformity, specificity, it's a empirical intelligibility of the sort that's denied in the argument from a variety that would frustrate our being able to have empirical concepts. So that you might think, yeah, this is just a different argument from this, unrelated to the second analogy, that just says something about empirical concepts. But what I'm saying is the strength of the reason he says it's an objective transcendental principle that's necessary for the possibility of experience, these maxims, they have indeterminate objective validity, is precisely because it's those constitutive demands of understanding that would be impossible to satisfy in this sort of scenario.
We have 3 remaining fingers for Steve's hand. Michael, Jim, and Karen.
I think you probably answered it, Jim. I mean, I don't really know whether this is the fair question you asked about Kant, but Sellars certainly wrote under the long shadow of the idea of the unity of science, I think. I mean, you just can't really even not think that. and I wonder whether your reading of Kant, or what you call the maximalist reading, suggests at least a leaning towards that. The idea, it's not just enough to have laws. Reason directs us to look for ways to unify. I mean, an assemblage of laws is not really a very satisfactory view of nature. It'd be nice to get something deeper that explains why just these laws at a certain level of explanation. And
that relates to Matthew's point.
And it relates to Matthew's point as well. And now, of course, there's a strong disunity of science movement. I mean, people think, well, first of all, the special sciences have proprietary concepts. They have distinctive kinds of idealization. There's no reason to think this maps onto fundamental physics in any interesting way, which itself is disunified. It's not as if, we can really understand things at the quantum level, at the macro relativistic level.
Philip Kitcher, just by the way, interprets the appendix to the dialectic in terms of Kitcher's own view of science as all about unification. So it's interesting. But there is another aspect to it.
So I just wondered what you thought about, does Kant give some aid and comfort to what later would become?
So I think, though, if
they were all neo-Kantians,
I think suppose that you do what I think Kitcher's stuff's very insightful on this, but if you do what Kitcher and Buchdahl and others do, and you make Kant all about systematic empirical science, that it's got to be a unity, that it has to be fully integrated, then you get a picture where that interest in reason, in complete unified systematicity, my reading, I take to have a virtue that doesn't have that, which is Kant has the idea of a complete systematic unity, but what's objectively valid are only these regulative maxims that hold back from any claim that nature itself has to be maximally systematically unified. So in this third critique passage toward the end, he says, we hold out hope that science will be unified, but how does he put it exactly? We'd prefer, judgment's presupposition about this unity is so indeterminate regarding the extent of that ideal that if we're told that a deeper or broadened knowledge of nature based on observation must meet with a diversity of laws that no human understanding can reduce to a single principle, then we'll be content with that too. So I feel like I have a way of understanding how these maxims can be objectively valid without the maximizing interest of reason being necessarily satisfied. What it specifies are these more broad hypothetical principles that we were justified in sort of assuming that nature's commensurate with our ability to know, but there's no particular maximum or no particular degree that's warranted.
Steve was probably right about replacing chaos with variety, particularly given
I think chaos is
exactly.
I agree.
Modern chaos theory, after all, its fully deterministic systems can be chaotic in the technical sense.
There's no reason.
They just have to be highly sensitive to initial small changes in initial conditions.
No, I think the way Steve put it was right. It's sort of defined in terms of what it would frustrate.
Jim. I want to go back to the exchange between Steve and Jim and Matt. My senses were onto both an important exegetical issue there, as well as I think probably a pretty deep philosophical issue that might connect up with some earlier discussion. But I'm really not too sure about it. I found myself one way to bring out how I'm not sure about it is I found myself kind of leaning towards the Matt Jim side of the debate, which meant I was disagreeing with Steve. And inductively, I found that when I disagree with Steve about Kant, I usually turn out to be wrong. So over time, so that's a reason, just a further reason to want to hang with this for a minute and make sure I see what's going on. I was also a little worried that some of the responses to Steve weren't kind of engaging the point the way he was putting it. So let me first try to state Steve's point the best I understand it. And then if I've got it, then let me also sort of say, despite that, why, for the moment, I can't be brought around to the truth, and then maybe I will be. So as I took Steve's point, we were imagining something like, there's two sets of issues. They both, in some vague sense, are conditions on experience. there's whatever the issue in the analogies is, and there's the issue in this passage about variety. And in some, unspecified sense, conditions on experience are in play in both. But it's important to distinguish them. This is all just me trying to be Steve for a minute. So in the analogies, we're concerned with formal conditions and the possibility of experience. Thinking through the very idea of experience is going to bring in the idea of categorical unity in one dimension of that 12-fold. Unity is going to be the one that comes up in the second analogy. We could say more about that, but I think the point that was more being missed, if I understood him, was what's at issue in this variety passage is not that, but something like an enabling material condition on the actuality of experience. That it's one thing to have this formal condition, but the categories. I'll put this as picturesquely as I can, partly I guess to anticipate the criticism, but the categories must be blessed with good fortune. And so if what comes in is just this endless profusion of variety, then we won't get experience. But now the problem is on the material side of the actuality of that which is given, not on the formal side. And that's how I was understanding your sense that these are both conditions of experience. They have something to do with each other. They're complementary, So they're deeply related, but we shouldn't identify one of the complements with the other. So that is your point. Good. So I didn't understand it, but now I think still I'm over here. What seems to me right is that there is room for the drawing of such a distinction. So, there could be, and it seems to be actually part of the issue of this passage you just read out, there could be laws that we fail to discern. And the right explanation of why we fail to discern has to do with features of, the material character of experience. Having to do with our failure of discrimination or the subtlety, with which they are, as it were, backgrounded by various other kinds of noise that we never discern that signal or whatever. So it's certainly right, there could be a failure to discern various forms of variety, and in certain cases, the right account of that wouldn't be the absence of the categories being in play, but a failure to schematize them in ways that would uncover these forms of unity. But the question, but this is something we can imagine more or less of. But how far can we turn the rheostat on this and still be talking about the same thing? Here, as Jim was describing, our imagination, what we're trying to imagine is something like a profusion of variety such that we have nothing but sheer variety. So that, as it were,
so great, anyway.
So great that no empirical concept, as it were, nothing yields to any rule of synthesis.
No concepts. No concepts even.
Yes, right.
Not even any concepts.
Right. And at that point, I feel like this isn't just something which I at least know how to think through and ascribe to, as it were,
difficult territory. Absolutely.
Well, in particular, I don't know how to ascribe now. Once the rheostats turn that far to something where I feel like the fault is just on the material side of matter conception. It seems like the very distinction between multiplicity and unity, or variety and law, are categorically interrelated. The apprehension of variety presupposes the apprehension of unity. I think there's Kantian arguments for this. So that there isn't anything which is, apprehending variety, but then in a second step, bringing variety under principles of synthesis, and all principles of synthesis failing. So I think the very thought that there is variety that's being apprehended requires...
There's no apprehension either.
There's no apprehension. That's what I mean. The lights are going out on the forms.
Exactly. There's no understanding. He said there's no understanding.
Okay, good. But that means that here what we have when we push the idea of variety that far, it's not something that's just a failure of a material condition, but there isn't anything for the forms of the understanding to be forms of. It's not like they're in play, but they can't find something to get a grip
material
of.
Side, isn't it? I mean, it's not as though there's a breakdown of form. It's rather the conditions under which form has material to which to be applied are not provided for.
But then wouldn't the right way to put it be that then our faculty, can't be triggered and grow, both in its formal and material aspect.
Exactly. It's not. Okay. You have to view it as a notional possibility. It's not incoherent, but it's not something we think through.
One question.
It seems as though it's not a real.
It
doesn't seem as though we can understand as a real possibility. That's for sure.
The passage is on page 15 of James's. Page. So after mentioning this possibility, whatever its meaning might be, Kant says, if therefore the logical principle generates to be applied to nature, it presupposes a transcendental principle. But I guess one way of putting my challenge to you is I don't see how there could be a transcendental principle that rules out the kind of possibility that you are talking about. Right, that nature is not so complex that it defies my understanding is something I discover in discovering that I have concepts, I guess. But it's not something that follows from an a priori principle, I would think. The principle of the possibility of... I don't know. Am I misunderstanding?
Well, it's delicate that... So when you talk about material principles, so some people use these considerations like Ken Westphal and others to argue for Kant's got some sort of background realist is Kant's right.
I'm not suggesting
and I've seen others do that as well, but this is my idea is that what he's arguing for is a series of necessary conditions on the possibility of experience. And the categorical principles are very general forms that are common to any possible experience.
Right.
But they do entail empirical instantiation. That's what it is for them to be applied to experience. Then he thinks he can specify further necessary conditions that have empirical content. But the degree to which they have empirical content, they become more indeterminate. I think this holds generally in Kant right up to the opus, but I think this is a generally interesting idea. So I think this passage specifies a transcendental principle in that it's necessary for the possibility of any experience at all. Now,
I'm agreeing.
Right.
And I'm too.
Okay.
Transcendental has to do with the possibility of a priori knowledge, right?
We can know a priori that nature in itself exhibits to an a priori indeterminable degree empirical uniformity of the kind that enables us to imply empirical concepts.
I was talking to Steve, and I just want to complete. I think the difference, the way I'm seeing it, Steve, is that the thing that's the really extreme case you're envisioning, that's
just what Kant's saying, right?
That's a possible case, and which I think is a little different than what Kant's saying, is a case in which there's so much variety that our cognitive faculty cannot operate. And therefore, I would say there is a kind of variety such that nothing presents appearances to us. What Kant seems to be describing here is an idea which I take it's supposed to fall apart in a way that grounds the transcendental principle in which we try to think of, which is we imagine we have appearances that constitute sheer variety, so that the variety comes into view as variety. That is, that's the dimension of the appearance, but yields to no rule synthesis. And that's the thing that I'm thinking doesn't make sense. The very possibility of the apprehension of variety requires
doesn't make sense
something.
to me either.
Right, yeah. But that's how we get a conclusion. Not that we're just that a transcendental principle is required. As opposed to there is a situation in which our cognitive luck was so bad we wouldn't grow a cognitive faculty. But that doesn't give us a transcendental principle in the same way. I think.
That can't. But that's in a way what you're saying, right? Because it seems like if since Kant is saying that the existence of the understanding depends on a certain minimal amount of unity, and that the presupposition of that minimum, couldn't be a transcendental. I think Matt was expressing something like that. It couldn't be a transcendental principle, just in the sense that there will be no point to it, because in order to, that of course that actuality, as it were, would already show that the actuality of understanding would already show that there is that much unity, and whatever principle that the understanding could formulate would already be supposed to exist. So then it seems like the principle would have to be something more like what Steve was suggesting.
But it gives it a slightly different status, doesn't it? The way you put it, that we have knowledge as a matter of fact, and that shows that there must be such empirical uniformities as enable that to be possible. That has a slightly different status from a different kind of argument that looks at the possibility of knowledge in general. It doesn't rely on the premise that we actually have knowledge. It seems that someone so it seemed that there was a slightly different.
But if you suppose that you have concepts, then it seems like any principle that you formulate is going to already have to. That is, any principle that you formulate that's supposed to be a condition of that, is already going to presuppose the actuality of. I guess what I'm saying that if by transcendental principles to be understood some presupposition, then it seems like you don't. I guess it's hard to make sense of a presupposition there. It just seems like it's already given with you're having concepts. That this much uniformity it's already given with the.
So let me see if the transcendental deduction works at a very high level that says something about what it is to have experience at all requires certain distinctions between the objective domain and my experience of it. And the principles then are, in a sense, application deductions in a kind of sense. They say that very minimal distinction between my experiences and the objects that they're of, which the deduction supposedly shows to be a valid distinction, requires in each of these 12 cases these sorts of further distinctions. So every alteration has to be conceived as necessitated. Now that's still operating at what you're calling the conceptual level. That still has to do with what's possible, what's necessary for the possibility of any experience at all. Then I take it that these arguments are of the same kind. They're further, but what they are slightly different, that they can't specify merely a priori what the form is that obtains. But indirectly there's an argument that unless nature had some degree of the following sort of thing, there would be no, and then you go back to the principles, there'd be no application possible of the principles that there has to be if there's to be a distinction in the first place between the objective and the subjective. So I see that as slightly different than just starting from the fact of experience empirically and arguing that there is a sort of harmony between, so that's the way I see it anyway.
Yeah, but you're starting from the fact that there are concepts and we have the principles and that these proofs worked.
Yeah.
And then I don't see a huge disagreement there. So Karen had the last
I have a passage in front of me that I think shows that actually there is less disagreement between Steve and the two genes, so that we should think about the distinction as a distinction between formal conditions and material conditions and general conditions and particular conditions, but yet the material conditions are not simply conditions of schematizing the formal conditions. So it's from the section 4 of the first unpublished introduction. So the understanding, however, abstracts in its transcendental legislation from nature from all multiplicity of possible empirical laws, in that legislation it takes into consideration only the conditions of the possibility of an experience in general as far as its form is concerned. So, formal condition. In it, therefore, that principle of the affinity of particular laws of nature is not to be found, yet the power of judgment which is obliged to bring particular laws, even with regard to what differentiates them under the same general laws of nature, under higher, though still empirical laws, must ground its procedure on such a principle. For groping about among forms of nature whose agreement with each other under common empirical but higher laws appeared entirely contingent to the power of judgment, it would be even more contingent if particular perceptions were luckily to be qualified for an empirical law. It would be all the more contingent if multiple empirical laws were to fit into a systematic unity of the cognition of nature in a possible experience in their entire interconnection without presupposing such a form in nature through an a priori principle. And just another paragraph.
Kant has its own finger now.
The principle of the purposiveness of the general purposiveness of nature is what the principle is. And I see that the crucial bit in the middle there was the need to bring particular laws under universal laws. I take to be a constitutive demand of the understanding.
I guess
that's because the universal laws have to be I'd have to look at the text, the way that he put it in. Well, you finish, make your point.
I'll just read another paragraph because I think you need to. So the question is how the possibility of nature as to its form connects to the possibility of nature as to its matter, something like that.
Yes.
How the conditions of the possibility of nature in general connects to possibility of experience in general connects to the possibility of experience in particular. That's what I took Steve to be saying, and I think, and you two want to argue that they are connected in a certain way that I'm not sure that Steve is actually rejecting. So, and here I think that Kant explains at least the two perspectives. And so he says...
can you read it a bit more slowly than the first one?
The first part again?
No. Whatever you're going to read now, just read it a bit more slowly. It was very hard to follow.
All of the stock formula, nature takes the shortest route. She does nothing in vain. She makes no leaps in the manifold of forms. She is rich in species, but sparing with genera, etc., and nothing other than this very same transcendental expression of the power of judgment in establishing a principle for experience as a system and hence for its own needs. Neither understanding nor reason can ground such a law of nature a priori, for while it may readily be understood that nature should be directed by our understanding in its merely formal laws, by means of which it is an object of experience in general, with regard to particular laws, in their multiplicity and diversity, it is free from all the restrictions of our law-giving faculty of cognition, and it is a mere presupposition of the power of judgment in behalf of its own use, always to ascend from empirical particular laws to more general, but at the same time still empirical ones, for the sake of the unification of empirical laws, which grounds that principle. And one can by no means charge such a principle to the account of experience, because only under the presupposition of it is it possible to organize experiences in a systematic way.
Mm-hmm. And some of what's in there is similar to what he does in the dialectic, when he says that this presupposition of a systematicity in empirical laws, nothing is entailed from the understanding about that, or this principle is not strictly derived from constitutive demands of understanding, or the idea of a nature in general. And those passages predominate throughout the introductions to the third critique as well. The idea that, but what's also in those arguments, I think, and it was in the very one that you read, is that the general form of nature, or the understanding, there are to be empirical laws. He'll put it. There is going to be. Now, what's the ground for that assumption? For some commentators, it kind of comes out of the possibility of systematic empirical science. And I want to say that Kant's just assuming that we'll realize that there have to be empirical laws if there are to be any instantiation of the categorical laws. But then he then continually emphasizes that there's no determining in all this diversity of the empirical what they're going to be. So what can we do? We can only say things like nature will be simple enough for us to know it, we'll have diversity, we'll be intelligible, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I see the same thing with the general form of nature and then the particular empirical laws, but this notion of contingency. So what's he really kind of concluding with this general principle of purposiveness? It's that we're going to find nature to be well ordered when we investigate it. That it's a bit like Peirce on an abduction in a way. It's when we move from the particular to the general, there's going to be general background intelligibilities that we're going to assume. And then commentators tend to then say that there are considerations about reason or about, it's only the broader systematic considerations at that point that kick in. But that's where I want to say it's precisely this. And it's where he uses the needs of Verstandesbedürfnis, because in the third critique he'll say it's the constitutive understanding that requires application in these empirical laws, but cannot determine what among the variety will be the empirical laws. So we're justified in making broader assumptions that nature is empirically systematic.
Jim, that's very quick. That was on experience.
That was
on experiences, not on appearances. And that is an important distinction between him talking here in your quote about appearances and here about experience.
I agree. The whole subject is different.
Yes, the subject is different.
Okay, well, I'm interested to hear that. So what's
what we were talking about was a condition of having appearances. This whole discussion of moving from the particular to the general means I've got some judgments, I've got some unity and diversity and vice versa. And now I seek more, And so once we've got some concepts, there are demands, that are made about what it is to do well with them. And so how our conception of nature shaped how we grow knowledge. But the point I was making this exchange with Steve, which Steve seemed to agree with this, we can't take that picture of going to the general and the particular and just in a sort of continuum kind of turn it down to the point. We reach this minimal point where we now have zero concepts. We just have diversity, and going from the particular to the general is understood as something like the unconceptualized to the first moments of conceptualization. That's not a continuum. Whatever the topic is about, here, it's one in which if this transcendental condition in that passage that we were talking about isn't reached, the lights go out. Whereas in these other passages, the lights are on, and now the issue is how we see better, given that the lights are on. And so our discussion here, and this much it seems to me Steve and I were agreeing about, is how should we understand what kind of the lights going off this is, and how the different things vary. But I think these discussions that are being brought in here just completely change the topic. And one worry is
we brought out a nice way of drawing a contrast between the indeterminate principle and the principle of maximal systematic unity. I mean, this is the gap we're talking about now in other terms.
Yes.
Okay. There's this in common. I don't know this distinction between appearances and experiences, and I'd be interested to hear about that. But both conversations, what happens in the appendix and what happens in these sorts of passages, have to do with the hypothetical use of
these
reason.
Passages are Karen's passages?
Yes.
Well, I agree. I was thinking Karen's passage is completely different from the one that the three of us or four of us were talking about.
I know, and this relates to Johannes' point as well, and I'm saying I see more in common between what's being addressed in the introductions and in the appendix. I'm agreeing with you on how we read the appendix argument, and you guys are saying there's something very strongly different going on throughout the introductions. Okay. I see the general principle of purposiveness. Is what's the highlight of sections 4 and 5 of the introductions to the third critique, and the concept of empirical systematicity and purposiveness in the appendix to the dialectic are both dealing with what's involved with finding the universal that fits the particular.
So,
and then my reading is that people forget that there's a background to that, and it's in the third critique introductions as well, which is the need for the universals to be instantiated in the particulars in the first place. That's the background in both the introductions and the appendix, and then that is what grounds the assumption that if you've got particulars and you're looking for the general, you're warranted in making certain broader assumptions. So, but I see the two as closely related that way.
Okay, Steve's
and I think
hand has somehow multiplied itself. So we have 2 fingers left, Robert's finger and Bill's finger, and then we will have an organical whole of 2 hands.
Yeah, well, I had a general question that's a version of what we discussed, but I might as well finger it in now because I might not get a chance. Finger it in.
Okay, I'll take your hand off the list then.
Oh, I don't leave my hand on the list.
Please.
Okay, so we'll put it in terms of your strategy in the paper. You want to connect what Kant says about the regulative principles of the understanding, the regulative maxims of reason, parse out their relationship by arguing both for the necessity of the latter, but also for its indeterminacy.
Right.
And I think the problem is those two things work against each other. The way to say that they work against each other is, given that it is required that we seek causal necessity in order to understand the events that we experience, any kind of general principle of purposiveness or systematicity or species ordering and so forth is, given its indeterminateness, relatively idle. In other words, why not just say what we need is as much uniformity and order and species specificity as we can find? That's what we're going to do anyway. There's nothing that's going to guide the actual practice of empirical science that comes from making higher order generalizations about the overall purposiveness of nature. Even if we say something like, we have to assume there's such purposiveness, it won't matter unless we can't find any. Unless we do find some, it won't matter if we can't find any.
So I take from what you're saying, what's the difference from just a pragmatic assumption that we need from...
The question I'm asking is not, isn't this a pragmatic... The question is, what difference does it make for the empirical investigation of the world, structured in a way by the requirements of the second analogy, that we have these general systematic principles about order, purposiveness, uniformity? What will matter is what we can find.
Yeah.
So why isn't the principle just find as much order and systematicity as you can and leave it at that?
Because I think there's an important philosophical point. It says one of the things people find most objectionable about Kant's view is that you have no intelligible connection between these a priori transcendental principles that are specified and the empirical world in terms of which they're supposed to be instantiated.
That's empirical science. You figure out which
now here's the following.
Right.
Now the following thing is interesting, I think. If what I'm saying is right, then he thinks he has a philosophical thing to say about the basis for our assumption that there are empirically intelligible.
We don't need any basis for our assumption. We investigate nature.
Philosophically, apparently, we do, because many people who then get this, have this idea that they look at Kant, and Kant says we have these a priori categorical principles, which have had no entailments about the empirical, and they say there's a massive gap between. This is why I think it's philosophically important, despite the fact that you're right. We're going to make hypotheses. But it's philosophically important, I think, that he has an account for why it's not just a mystery, the relationship between these transcendental principles and empirical concepts.
What he says is, let's assume it.
No, he doesn't. He has a series of arguments.
But the argument is, we wouldn't be able to do empirical science. As I understand the way you're parsing it, we wouldn't be able to do empirical science.
No, not empirical science. We wouldn't be able to even instantiate the sorts of categories that he's allegedly proven are necessary, such as...
Why not? We find some causes.
And then he has an argument that our finding causes isn't just a contingent, that there are empirical laws to be discovered that will instantiate the categories isn't just a matter of pragmatic.
Why can't it be?
He thinks that it makes intelligible sense that there must be such empirical uniformity
Well, I
to
think
be
the
discovered.
necessity is arguing is sort of qualifying so much the indeterminacy part that they're not working together. It's necessary that we have this assumption, or what?
It's necessary that there exist in nature empirical uniformities and that are not specifiable a priori what they are. That's
so one scientist has this assumption that it believes it and another doesn't. What's the difference? They're both going to be churning away their experiments in the laboratory.
Yeah.
It's not going to make any difference to which regularities we find turn out to be gnomic necessities. That's not going to make any difference. The idea that we have a philosophical case that nature has a propositiveness that gives us some reason to hope we may find empirical causal laws.
Yeah, these regulative maxims are not going to entail any particular thing that's going to be inconsistent with one scientist doing one thing versus another.
I don't mean they actually give
it says that the assumption that is shared by all these empirical inquirers isn't just brutally related to the sorts of things he's been arguing about, the need for concepts to have any experience of a world at all.
I don't see the bite of we need to have these. I mean, I can see we might have a kind of philosophical interest in the fact that nature is not alien to our cognitive interests.
Yeah.
We might find that an interesting question.
Yeah.
But there was something in your account that seemed to say, I can give you why Kant uses these notions of subjective validity and necessity and seems to let the transcendental enter the discussion of regulative maxims, because if we didn't propose maximization or order or systematicity or no leaps, we wouldn't, something would be a problem philosophically.
Yeah,
I don't see the problem philosophically.
Not maximization is the one I said wasn't quite.
Put that aside.
Right. What's the status of this assumption that there are empirical uniformities in nature to be discovered? Now, as you say, that you're not going to get from a priori transcendental philosophy a warrant for any particular things that someone will go on to discover. The argument, though, is that considerations of just the possibility of any experience at all is what's supposed to be interesting from Kant's perspective. Warrants not only these general categorical principles, which it does, but he thinks a further argument can be given about what it takes to instantiate those in general in an empirical reality that warrants the conclusion that nature must exhibit empirical uniformities. It doesn't give you a principle of induction because it doesn't.
No.
But it gives you. It relates to the possibility of any experience at all. The assumption that nature exhibits empirical uniformities of an a priori unspecifiable kind, but that nature itself exhibits.
Well, does that mean that unless we had systematically ordered causal laws, we couldn't experience the world? Is that what you're saying?
It entails, well, you say systematically ordered. It does entail that there's a certain minimal degree of uniformity, say in the generic argument, and then there's other ones. That if nature didn't exhibit at least the sorts of uniformities that are necessary, he argues, for the application of empirical concepts, say, of generic kinds of things and diversity, and there would be no application of the category.
What about ages and ages in which people had all the wrong causal laws?
Well, this exactly helps to understand, I think, what Kant's whole... So here's why I find it useful. So say I work on the first analogy. The first analogy entails, say, that if experience of duration is to be possible, and I'm not going to say these, let's just give kind of it. All changes have to be conceived as subject shared, basically. All experienced changes have to be conceived of alterations of a subject that's identical. Now the question is, how do you get to the absolute permanent? And I have a reading of that. But now my view is that the question of what that materials, what that permanent substance is parallel to the question of what the empirical cause is, say, for any given thing like the wax melting, and we hypothesize that it's the heat of the sun. So my view is then that the first analogy entails that in previous ages it might have been thought to be Thales' water, and then it might have been thought to be Newton's matter, and then it might be thought to be mass energy, and so on and so forth. But for any so this is the way I read the analogies that way. So it's an indeterminate existence claim, just like the second analogy is. And we can understand then why our hypotheses about what fulfills that has continually changed through history, and yet that these hypotheses are proposed instantiations of the first analogy.
Yeah, and they're all different, and they all could be said to be consistent with the overall principles that you want the regulative maxims of reason to say, which is just another indication that regulative maxims of reason aren't doing any work. Kant admits that the regulative maxims of reasons they don't entail any particular. But what I think this is Kant's problem. I'm not saying this is your problem. I think you've accurately stated what Kant's project tries to say. No, but I think I don't understand this part of it. Why not just as much unity as we can find? But I think that I think that what follows from this is that there's not just a leap from. I think it's philosophically significant that he can relate these fallible hypotheses about the empirical details of things, not just to it's nice to have them and let's hope we can find some, but also to, in fact, it turns out there's just a distinction that it turns out to be necessary for the possibility of any experience at all. That there is some, and then you're right, that it doesn't entail which hypothesis is correct, precisely not, but that's what makes sense. So many of the criticisms of Kant's view from the perspective of Hegel and so on would be that it gives you this abstract formal characterization of laws that swings entirely free with no intelligible connection to the material, what's going to present itself materially. But this shows that if it works, that Kant was sensitive and thought he had an argument that and you say the fact that it's indeterminate means it's useless philosophically, but I think that just the fact that you can't specify a priori what the empirical forms are doesn't mean it's philosophically useless to see that there's a ground in the possibility of experience at all, that there be some such empirical uniformity. I think it intelligibly relates to what you're saying, but it still sounds like the expression of a hope to me, not a justification of something that's eventually going to be connected to the possibility. It's a necessary condition on the possibility of experience. Okay. Now, what's a hope is that we can maximize it, that it'll be somehow systematically complete and all of that. But no, it's supposed to be a strict necessary condition on the possibility of experience.
If I'm right,
this is a finger to a finger. Is that?
Yeah. If I'm right in thinking that I still have 3 hands on my list, I will not take.
Is mine one of them?
You have one hand.
Cede my hand to
okay, no hand. Arada had a hand. No hand anymore. Do you still have your hand?
What?
If there's only one hand left, I can take the finger.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Please. And Bill was first. Bill had the first finger, then Michael, and then Arada's hand.
Okay. What's your finger?
Well, I thought the discussion between Steve and the gyms was very interesting, but I asked myself, okay, how much variety? People were worried that there was no transcendental principle for saying how much variety would lead to the deconstruction of the mind. And isn't this I don't know the text well enough to know if this is something Kant actually ever said, but isn't this an answer that would be available to him? That look, if there's a principle, if the principle is that how much variety is required in order for there to be experience, is in fact not something that can be fixed beforehand, because it depends upon both the variety present in the world and the power of the intellect that's searching in the world, or that's encountering the world. An intellect with greater power, which I assume means at least things like, longer memory, greater imagination, things like that, will be able to construct experience in the face of greater variety. A lesser intellect, less. So he doesn't have, as it were, you need X amount of variety in order to have experience. He says we have to adjust the amount of variety to the power of the intellect. And what's the power of our intellect? Well, that's something we have to find out by experience, right? I mean, that's not something that is itself open to a priori determination. And
I mean, I was seeing more
human understanding is what he says.
Yeah,
I saw it more along Jim's line that there's an argument by reductio attempting to specify a certain kind of, it's not actually possible in the sense of the possibility of experience.
Well, I think if you turn the rheostat all the way down, clearly that's as Mark kept whispering here, it's a reductio. There's no experience is possible if the variety is, as it were, so big that we could never notice any kind of patterns.
And why isn't the argument by reductio
but there is an answer to the question, how much do you need? And it's in part, or how much variety can you withstand? And it's a part tied to what's the power of the intellect. And that's a common notion at the time. They talk about finite intellects and infinite intellects and more. There's a whole range of possible intellectual powers. So he's got those facilities available to them. He can say, look, that's how it would work. So I don't need to give you any more determinate answer because that's the answer that there is.
I think there's two notions of variety, issues of variety that I want to distinguish. I wanted to distinguish before. We have a subject and we have experience coming in. And we're looking at both of them from the side. And we can say, wow, there's a lot of variety coming in. And maybe the subject is doing something with it. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's overwhelmed by it. Maybe he's getting half of it. But here the individuation of the variety is, as it were, from the sideways on position. Then there's another question, which has to do with the condition of the possibility of appearances, where there's a thought that what appears is variety. So now the variety is not just variety that's out there in some sense. It's variety, as it were, that which is being described as in the order of appearance. But now we imagine that in the order of appearance, there's variety of such a sort that we can't do anything with it. There's such a profusion or something like that. That's the thing that's a reductio argument, I'm taking it. That the very idea of the apprehension of variety in the order of appearances is such that we cannot find any rule of synthesis for it. Is an idea we can't think through. That the apprehension of variety, the appearance of variety presupposes also the synthesis of unity. That's not a point about what's coming in on the side. And that argument about the character of appearance, that the very idea of variety has, in its apprehension, has as a transcendental condition a certain kind of unity or order, that I'm thinking has a point. That's a point about what it is for the lights to be on at all. And I'm thinking that's a very different kind of topic than another topic that's been discussed a lot, which is once we have concepts, maybe really lousy ones, that allows us to find some unity and variety, what is the shape of what sort of internal demands are there in cognition, such that from there the way we go on is pruning our concepts, relating general laws to particular laws. But this has to do now with relationship of particularity and generality, where we can distinguish the apprehension of particularity from something more general, where it's still coming into view. And that's in the order of cognition once we have, as it were, apperception. I'm taking the other argument to be a condition on the unity of apperception. You might say even a condition on false judgment, even falsely judging X to be Y is going to require that we don't just have variety, but we also have unity.
I agree with that. And then you and Johannes think that the third critique passages are then different from that. Right,
certainly the one that Karen read. There's
right.
all kinds of passages about different things.
Yeah, right. And I think when you
A great variety.
I don't want to say what passages about instruction we're looking at.
Yeah, but
My impression
you don't disagree with any of that. The question is, is there a next level of quasi-transcendental
I thought Jim
requirements?
was trying to treat these two issues
as
too continuous, and that gets
No, I mean there's three steps. There's that step. Then there's the step about the regulative maxims of reason being required, and then there's a third step in which you go back to the conditions of experience and you try to make some other case for why the causal laws. This is the way I understand you. The causal laws that would not be possible were it not for the regulative maxims of reason being invoked and assumed to have a certain necessity. If there weren't those causal laws, not the ones we get, just by the transcendental case, there must be some. But if there weren't those integral to the regulative maxims of reason project, we couldn't have experience. I don't get the two steps. The first one I think is undisputable, and you're not disputing it.
Let's take the second analogy as an example. It entails that apprehending this as an alteration requires that there existed something that necessitated it, an empirical causal law.
Right.
Then, in both the third critique and the appendix, you have what he's calling the hypothetical use of reason or reflective judgment. He'll describe things like, here's something, what was its cause? He might do it in terms of empirical laws in relation to you, but there's other places where he'll do it in terms of finding an empirical concept for a particular appearance. And we can grope about and get lucky, but he uses that several times. But let's set that aside for the moment. Then he argues that, the laws from the second analogy is not going to entail anything about which particular empirical law fits the case.
Right.
But then he gives various arguments that if there wasn't an empirical concept to fit the case, then there wouldn't be any instantiation of the categorical principles, and in fact the experience, which it wouldn't be possible at all in the first place. So that combination of there has to be an empirical law as demanded by understanding, but it being not legislatable by understanding, is what warrants these more broad maxims that nature must exhibit uniformity such that we can instantiate it from the categories. Now there is this other thing which was we maximize, but that just turns out to be the only way to represent, semantically as it were, the only object that we can give to that general assumption.
But what's that issue with Jim is there anything we need to supplement the second analogy argument? Not just to show that there cannot be events experienced that are not subject to the demand that there be a prior event from which it succeeds with necessity. That itself, that argument, would be incomplete were there not another principle.
Wouldn't be instantiatable.
Wouldn't be instantiatable.
It's complete in itself that there must be.
But doesn't the deduction establish that it can't not be instantiatable for there to be?
That's why the critique, from the analytics through the dialectic and into the third critique, is a series of nested necessary conditions that are necessary for the possibility of experience.
But I take it back. He is saying what you're saying.
He is saying what I'm saying.
Now, I thought I agreed with Jim in his way of reading the reductio.
I just find that so implausible. I couldn't attribute it to you. So.
Which fits implausible? So the second analogy, you're not finding implausible that it entails that there must exist particular empirical causal laws, but can't determine which there are.
Yeah, that's enough. Now we go find.
Yeah, and then then there's the second stage of argument that says that there have to be certain general other. That if nature...
That's smoke.
Yeah.
That's just smoke and mirrors.
There shouldn't be an appendix.
Find it. That's all we have to do is find it.
Okay, Michael.
No, I go.
Okay, then I have Arada's hand. And 5 minutes to go.
Okay. So this actually goes back to just the second analogy. It doesn't really deal with that. So the sense in which it's regulative. So like I think you you want to, like, one of the things that you want to do is spell out some like generic sense of regulative that in which the second analogy is regulative.
Yeah, that seems to be nice.
Yeah, and that it has to do with so I mean it does relate to the the issue about indeterminacy, and both involve sort of like an indeterminacy, like existence presupposition, or an indeterminate. I suppose
they're both indeterminate existence.
Okay, is that right? Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So, I guess the axioms and the anticipations they're also indeterminate in important sense. That is, it's a priori not determinable. What the specific you need an empirical concept under which you can think of an intensive magnitude or extensive magnitude. Whether it's of
I think I know where you.
Right, and it seems like he in characterizing the passages you cite, in characterizing the regulative character of I guess all the analogies. He stresses that it can't be constructed. That the category that
existence cannot be
existence cannot be constructed, and there it seems like he has in mind that something like in the other two in the mathematical case, mathematical principles. There's you're dealing simply there with as it were, the aspects of intuition,
right, yeah.
Whether it's the form in the case of the axioms or the content of the matter in the case of the anticipations. Whereas with the analogies, you're actually dealing with the object, so to speak, the object, the something that is exists, which is an object of the intuition, and so you're actually dealing with an existence claim. So even so, it's not even the cause, but even the effect, right? The supposed effect is supposed to involves an existence claim.
Well, that's supposed to be given. Is, for any given experience, alteration. There must exist. So,
but there's also an existence claim with regard to, like, the determinate temporal succession of.
So the way I see it is, I think it's tricky, but the way is the axioms and anticipations. Although you can't anticipate a priori what degree of reality or what magnitude of extension. You can specify a priori because those are mathematical principles of any intuition in any given case. The form of, namely, that it will be an intensive magnitude or a extensive magnitude. Relative to that, where you can specify just what type of thing it is, to put it crudely, and will be in each case. The second analogy, you can specify that there must be a cause, but as he says, you can't specify what or how much or anything about what type of thing that cause will be, other than that it will be causally necessitate the event that you experience. Then when you move to the second regulative constitutive distinction, where all the principles of understanding are constitutive, then he's emphasizing that you can specify the form in advance with regard to the analogies, because here you're talking about not what's going to be intuited as the type of thing it is, but the form of the temporal laws that will characterize any given experience. Those are what you can't do with the regulative maxims, is even specify, and this is, you can't even specify what type of form of thing you're going to.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just wondering, because it doesn't seem like indeterminacy is where the regulative character is coming in. It's like non-constructibility, or it's the difference between existence and
indeterminacy means can't be determined a priori, and that does relate. I'm a little cautious about constructibility because sometimes he wants that to relate to mathematical. But you're right. It means indeterminate here means not determinable a priori.
So we can end this with an agreement.
Did that seem to work?
We're out of time. Let's thank Jim. Good points, but it's really hard to see the place.